Here's your $50. Margaret. My daughter-in-law said it with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, the smile of a woman who had spent 3 years convincing my son I was a burden, a liability, a ghost from a past that should stay buried. She slid the envelope across the restaurant table like it was a tip for a valet. $50. For 30 years of sacrifice she would never know about. What she didn't know was that my late husband, her father-in-law, had left something behind that no lawyer, no court, and no amount of her careful maneuvering could touch. And I was the only one who knew where it was. Before I tell you how it all came apart, let me know in the comments where you're listening to this story from, and if you believe that the truth always finds a way home. Please subscribe to Dad's Cold Justice, because sometimes justice moves quietly. And then all at once, the smell of salt air and old timber was the only perfume I ever needed. For the past 6 years, my life had been this: a small house in Gloucester, Massachusetts, 3 blocks from the water. A fishing boat I kept maintained, not because I still fished commercially, but because the work of it, the caulking, the sanding, the honest physical labor of keeping something seaworthy, was the only thing that kept me from disappearing entirely into grief. My name is Ruth Calloway. I am 67 years old. I was married to Daniel Calloway for 31 years. And when he died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago, I thought the hardest thing I would ever face had already passed. I was wrong. Daniel had built Calloway Marine Engineering from nothing. A small drafting table in our spare bedroom became a firm that designed navigation systems for commercial shipping vessels. Quiet, specialized, unglamorous work that turned out to be worth, according to the lawyers, somewhere in the region of $8 million. He had never been flashy about it. He drove the same truck for 12 years. He fixed the gutters himself. He called me every day at noon when he was traveling, without fail. For 3 decades, he was the most constant thing I had ever known. And when he was gone, I found that constancy had been the architecture of my entire self. My son, Carter Calloway, was 41 and lived in Boston with his wife, Diane. Diane was a corporate attorney. She was precise and beautiful in the way that very expensive things are beautiful, engineered to impress at a distance. She had never liked me. I understood this the way you understand the weather, not personally, but as a fact that required planning. What I had not understood, not until it was too late, was the degree to which she had been working methodically, patiently on Carter, turning him slowly, like a key in a lock. When Daniel died, Carter handled everything with an efficiency that should have been a comfort but felt, in retrospect, like a rehearsal. The first hint came 3 months after the funeral. Carter called on a Sunday evening, unusual in itself. "Mom," he said, using the word like a placeholder for something he didn't want to say. "We've been looking at your situation. Diane and I, we think it might make more sense financially, practically, for you to consider a smaller place. Something easier to manage. Something closer to us." I looked out my window at the harbor, at the lights on the water, at the boat bobbing at its mooring. Something closer to them. Something Diane could oversee. I told him I was fine. He said he'd call again soon. He didn't. For 6 weeks. The second hint was the estate lawyer. Not Daniel's lawyer. A man named Harold Fitch, who had been Daniel's friend since college and who had the face of a man who had seen too much and said too little, but a new lawyer, hired by Carter, who sent me a letter explaining that he had been retained to assist in the management of my late husband's estate during the probate period. The letter was 4 pages. It was very thorough. It contained phrases like asset optimization and estate liquidity assessment and transition planning for the primary beneficiary. I read it twice. Then I called Harold Fitch. Harold listened to me, read the letter over the phone. There was a pause. "Ruth," he said carefully, "I need you to come to my office. There are some things about Daniel's affairs that I think you need to understand before you sign anything anyone sends you." I drove the 40 minutes to his office in Marblehead the next morning. Harold had the kind of office that told you immediately who he was. Cluttered, full of books, smelling of coffee and pipe tobacco he no longer smoked, but which had soaked permanently into the walls. He poured me a cup and sat down across from me, and his face was very still. "There is a document," he said. "Daniel brought it to me 2 years before he died. He told me he hoped you would never need it. He also told me that if anyone, and he was specific about this, Ruth, anyone at all tried to alter, redirect, or in any way contest the disposition of his estate, I was to give you this envelope and tell you to read it alone. Harold slid the envelope across his desk. It was sealed with a strip of red wax, which was so very Daniel that I almost couldn't breathe. He had always had a sense of ceremony about the things he considered important. I put the envelope in my purse and drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time before I opened it. Daniel's handwriting was not elegant. It was the handwriting of an engineer, precise, utilitarian, slightly too small for the lines. But reading it felt like hearing his voice. He wrote, Ruth, if you are reading this, something has gone sideways, and I am sorry I am not there to stand beside you. What I am about to tell you, I should have told you years ago. I didn't, because I was ashamed, and because I believed it was finished, and because you had enough to carry without the weight of my worst chapter. I was wrong to keep it from you. I hope you can forgive me, and I hope what I've arranged is enough to make it right. The letter was 11 pages. It took me 2 hours to read it. When I was done, I sat in the kitchen of my house in Gloucester, listening to the sound of the harbor, and I understood for the first time the full shape of the life I had lived inside all the rooms I had never been shown. All the weight my husband had carried in silence. All the years he had spent building something clean and honest out of something that had started in darkness. 22 years before his death, Daniel had been a different kind of man. Not a bad man, but a frightened one. His company was young, barely 5 years old, and he had taken a contract that he should have refused. A shipping consortium out of Rotterdam wanted specialized navigation systems installed on a fleet of vessels operating in international waters. The contract was large. Larger than anything Callaway Marine Engineering had ever handled. Daniel signed it without doing the due diligence he would have done a decade later. When he was wiser, the consortium, it emerged slowly, was moving more than cargo. The vessels were part of a network that used falsified manifests and custom navigation routing to avoid inspection at certain ports. Daniel's systems, his intellectual property, his engineering certificates, were being used to make the whole operation more invisible. When he realized it, he was already 18 months into the contract. He was 42 years old. Carter was 19, and at college, and the business had employees who depended on it. He did not go to his lawyer first. He went, in the panic of a man who saw his family's entire future collapsing, to his college roommate, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had gone into finance and who always seemed to know people. Gerald said he knew someone who could help. The someone was a man who operated in the specific business of making difficult corporate problems disappear. His name, in the context of these transactions, was never spoken aloud. The arrangement was this. Daniel would quietly amend several of the navigation system certifications, small technical alterations that would make the routing logs look like standard commercial variants, rather than deliberate evasion. In return, the consortium would release him from the contract cleanly, without publicity, and would provide him with a performance bond payment, a sum that, on paper, looked like normal contract completion fees, totaling $400,000. Daniel did it. He told himself it was one time. He told himself no one was hurt. He deposited the money into a reserve account. I bought a piece of equipment the business needed, and spent the next 2 decades trying to forget it had ever happened. He almost succeeded. Then, 4 years before he died, a federal maritime investigation opened into the Rotterdam consortium. It was a big case. 7 countries. 2 years of surveillance. The investigators were methodical. They were working backward through every contract and subcontract the consortium had touched. They reached Daniel in the spring of his 63rd year. 2 agents came to his office. They were polite. They laid a file on his desk. They told him what they knew and what they suspected. They offered him a choice. What Daniel did then was the thing that I, reading his letter at my kitchen table, understood immediately and completely, and with a grief so clean it felt almost like love. He called Harold Fitch. He sat with Harold for 3 days. And then he went back to the federal investigators and he told them everything. Not a partial version. Not the version that protected his reputation. Everything. He gave them Gerald Marsh. He gave them the documentation of the consortium's routing patterns, which his own engineering records could reconstruct. He gave them, in short, the kind of testimony that costs a man everything he has spent his life building, because it is the right thing to do, and because he had already decided he could not die with it unspoken. The investigators, in exchange for his full cooperation, agreed to a sealed disposition. No criminal charges. No public record. His license was quietly reviewed and quietly reinstated on the basis of coercion and full cooperation. The $400,000 was repaid to the Federal Asset Recovery Fund. Daniel told no one. Not Carter. Not me. He restructured his will with Harold's help, established certain legal instruments I had not known existed, and then he went on living. He fixed the gutters. He called me at noon. He drove the same truck. He put his whole self into being a good man for whatever years he had left, and he let me love him without knowing what it had cost him. The dinner was Carter's idea. He called it a family discussion. The restaurant was in Boston. Expensive. The kind of place Diane liked, all muted lighting and servers who materialized silently. Carter was dressed in a blazer he would never have worn in the years when he and I were close. Diane was in a silk blouse. Her posture. The posture of a woman who has already won the argument she is about to have. There was a man with them, introduced as Warren Chesley, in their financial consultant, a man in his early 50s with the practiced warmth of someone who charges by the hour to convince people to do things they shouldn't. The conversation was managed. That is the only word. Carter presented it as concern. Mom. The estate is complex. The marine engineering firm has ongoing contracts. There are tax implications. Diane and I have been talking. Warren has been very helpful in mapping out a transition strategy. The words came in a smooth, practiced flow, like a river that has been rerouted through a channel. The strategy, as it emerged, involved a family trust that would consolidate all of Daniel's assets, the company, the house, the reserve accounts under a management structure in which Carter and Diane held joint administrative authority. I would receive a monthly distribution. It was, Warren explained with a smile, a very common arrangement. When Warren had finished, Diane reached into her bag and slid an envelope across the table. There was a warmth in her smile that I had never seen before, and I understood it now. It was the warmth of relief, of a woman who has spent 3 years positioning for a moment and believes the moment has finally arrived. This is just a small gesture, she said, from Carter and me, to cover any immediate expenses while we get everything sorted out. We know this is a lot to process. I looked at the envelope without touching it. Carter was watching me with the expression of a man who wants to believe he is doing the right thing because someone he trusts has told him he is. Warren was making small adjustments to his cufflinks. Open it. Mom, Carter said quietly. I opened it. Inside was a check for $50. I looked at it for a moment. I looked at Diane's careful, warm expression, and I understood the $50 was not a gift. It was a statement. It was the opening number in an accounting that she intended to control entirely. I put the check back in the envelope. I set the envelope on the table. I picked up my water glass and I drank from it and I set it down and I looked at all 3 of them very calmly. And I said I'd like to speak with Harold Fitch before I sign anything at all. And the warmth in Diane's smile turned to something that was not warm at all. Carter and Diane had scheduled the formal meeting with Harold for a Thursday morning in Harold's Marblehead office. I think they expected it to be brief, a formality, a signature, the efficient transfer of everything Daniel had built into the structure they had designed. They came with Warren Chesley and a junior attorney from Diane's firm named Preston, who carried a briefcase and said very little. I arrived first, which was unusual. I sat in Harold's waiting room and I listened to the sound of the harbor through the old windows, the same sound as my kitchen at home, and I held my hands in my lap and waited. Carter came in and hugged me with an arm that felt careful. Diane gave me a smile. Warren nodded. Preston adjusted his briefcase. Harold came out of his office and shook hands with everyone and invited them in. The meeting room was small. A table. 6 chairs. More books on the shelves than any normal person needed. Harold sat at the head of it, which I noticed Carter did not expect. Carter had positioned himself to sit there. Harold simply arrived in the chair first. with the quiet authority of a man on his own ground. And Carter sat to the side without comment. Harold opened a folder. He was methodical by nature. He always had been. He reviewed the standard estate documents first, the original will, the summary of assets. The accounting Harold's firm had prepared of the company's current contracts and valuation. Diane and Warren listened with the focused attention of people waiting for a number they already know. Carter listened with the slightly glazed look of a man who has been told what to think and is trying to hold on to it. When Harold finished the overview, Warren cleared his throat. "So," he said, "we'd like to move to the consolidation proposal." We've prepared documents. That Harold held up one hand, a single patient gesture. He said, "There is another matter we need to address first." He said it exactly that way. Not urgently. Not dramatically. The way a man says that the structural issue is in the foundation rather than the roof, not to alarm, but because accuracy requires it. From a second folder, different color. Thicker, he removed a document. He placed it on the table. It was bound in blue. It had a seal on the cover. Diane, who read documents the way most people breathe, saw the seal and went very still. "It is a codicil," Harold said, "signed by Daniel 14 months before his death, witnessed by myself and by a notary, and by 2 independent parties whose names and credentials you will find on the execution page. Signed," he added, "in full and documented cognitive capacity, as confirmed by his physician, whose letter is attached as Exhibit A." Carter said quietly, "I don't understand." "What is that?" Harold said. "It is the document your father prepared in the event that anyone attempted to alter the distribution of his estate." Then he began to read. He read the opening section, which was legal language, standard codicil language, affirming the principal's identity and intent. Then he turned the page, and the language changed, and it was Daniel's voice, pure and plain. The voice of the man who called me at noon for 30 years. And I had to fold my hands in my lap very tightly to keep them still. Harold read, "I am writing this because I know what people sometimes become when there is money in the room. Not because I think badly of my son, whom I love, but because I have seen grief make people into instruments of other people's designs, and I want to protect against that. And I want to be honest. And I have not always been honest. And this is where that changes." Harold paused. He turned the page. Carter was frowning, not angry yet. Confused. The frown of a man trying to locate himself on a map. Diane's face was a careful blank. Warren had gone very still. Harold read the full account. Not quickly. Not slowly. He read it the way it was written, with the methodical precision of a man who had decided that if a thing was worth saying, it was worth saying completely. The Rotterdam Consortium. The falsified certifications. The payment. Gerald Marsh, who had provided the contact. And then the part that changed the temperature in the room, the federal investigation, the cooperation, the sealed disposition, the $400,000 repaid. Harold read for 22 minutes without stopping. When he finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the harbor again through the old windows. Carter said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know any of this." His voice had a quality I hadn't heard in 3 years. Young, undefended. The performance he'd been wearing for this meeting had slipped entirely. "I didn't know," he said again, as if the repetition might locate him somewhere. Harold said, "He didn't want you to. He was ashamed. And he believed it was finished. And he was wrong to keep it from you." Those are his own words. Carter looked at me. And for the first time in a long time he looked like my son, not Carter who lived in Boston with Diane, not Carter who had allowed a woman with a consolidation strategy to talk him into sliding $50 across a restaurant table, but Carter, my son, who used to fall asleep in the car on long drives and trust me completely to get him home. Diane had not spoken since the reading began. She was looking at the codicil document with the expression of a lawyer reading a contract that has just made her entire strategy irrelevant. Because it had. Because what Harold read next, the legal disposition that the codicil established, was the thing she had not anticipated. The room in the building she had not measured, Harold said. In recognition of Ruth Calloway's partnership in all that Callaway Marine Engineering represents, including sacrifices she was not informed of and burdens she was not asked to share. Daniel Calloway directs the following. First, the family trust proposal, or any similar instrument designed to alter Ruth Calloway's sole authority over the estate, is null and void. Any such instrument, if signed under these terms, is declared invalid. Second, Ruth Calloway retains full title to the family home in Gloucester, all personal property, and all liquid accounts. Third, and here Harold's voice did something, a slight modulation, almost too small to notice the controlling interest in Calloway Marine Engineering, currently valued at $7,800,000, passes to Ruth Calloway in its entirety. No conditions, no management structure, no trustees, entirely and without restriction. Warren Chesley, who had made a career out of managing the financial affairs of people with more money than foresight, stood up. He did it with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who knows when a room has turned. He said, "I think I should give the family some privacy." He closed his briefcase. He did not look at Diane. He walked to the door, and he went through it, and he did not come back. Preston, the junior attorney, looked at Diane. Diane gave one tiny shake of her head. Preston gathered his documents quietly, like a man tidying up after an event that had not gone as planned, and followed Warren out. That left four of us. Harold, who was already calmly replacing documents in their folders with the focused efficiency of a man who has done everything he needed to do. Carter, who was looking at the table with the expression of a person reviewing the last several years from a new vantage point and finding that the geography had changed substantially. Diane, who was still looking at the codicil with the precise, careful expression of someone calculating options. And me. Diane spoke first. She looked up from the document, and she looked at me, and her voice was level and controlled, and she said, "This will be contested." She said it the way she said everything declaratively, as a statement of what would happen rather than what she intended. Her professional self had taken over from whatever personal feeling was underneath it. And I respected that even as I understood what it meant. I looked at her. I had not disliked Diane as a person for 3 years. I had found her frightening in the way that all things are frightening that operate very smoothly in pursuit of what they want. I said, "You'll want to read Exhibit A carefully before you decide that." Harold, without looking up, said, "The psychiatric evaluation ran to 68 pages, 3 neurologists. The date of signing was witnessed by the county clerk." He closed his folder with a gentle thud. It was a sound like a door being shut on a particular room. "The Codicil," he said, "is as airtight as anything I have prepared in 40 years of practice." Daniel was very thorough. He always was. The silence that followed was different from the silence during the reading. That had been the silence of people receiving information. This was the silence of a particular calculation being run, and the result coming back negative. I watched Diane understand that the room she had been trying to enter for 3 years did not, in fact, have a door on this side. Carter was still looking at the table. Then he looked at me. "Mom," he said. His voice had a quality in it not asking for forgiveness. Not yet. But the sound of someone who has just located the entrance to that question. I looked at my son. I thought about Daniel calling me at noon for 30 years. I thought about the letter in his precise engineer's handwriting. I thought about 11 pages of shame and love and the weight of a secret carried quietly for 2 decades. I thought, this is not Carter's fault. This is what happened to Carter. And those are different things. Harold excused himself to make a call. Diane stood up. She looked at me once more, a look that was not hostile and not warm, and a look of one woman acknowledging that another woman had just been underestimated significantly, and she walked out. Carter and I sat on opposite sides of Harold's table with its stacks of books and its smell of old coffee. And neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Then Carter said, "Why didn't he tell me?" His voice broke slightly on the word "me." I thought about Daniel's letter, about the shame and the fear and the belief that some things, if you buried them deeply enough, would stop being part of the world. I said he thought he was protecting you, the same way he always protected both of us, the way he thought men were supposed to do it alone. Carter put his face in his hands. He didn't cry. He just sat there with his face covered for a moment, breathing. When he took his hands away, he looked older and younger at the same time. He said, "I think I have to apologize to you." I said I think we both have some work to do. And I meant it. Harold came back. He sat down. He looked at Carter with the expression of a man who has been watching this family for 30 years and expected, more or less, that it would eventually arrive here. He set one more thing on the table. It was an envelope, smaller than the others, sealed with the same red wax as the one he had given me months before. Carter's name was on the outside. In Daniel's handwriting, Harold said, "He left that for you. He asked me to give it to you when I felt the moment was right. I am choosing now." Carter picked it up. He held it for a moment. He looked at me. I nodded. He opened it. I did not read that letter. That was between Daniel and his son, and whatever was in it belonged entirely to the two of them. But I watched Carter read it, and I watched his face move through a series of expressions that I did not have words for, and when he finished, he folded it carefully and held it and said nothing for a long time. What I will tell you is that he came to Gloucester the following weekend. He came alone. He helped me caulk a section of the boat's hull that had needed attention for 2 months. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The harbor was the same harbor. The sound of the water was the same sound. And when the work was done, we sat on the dock and he said I didn't know who he was. Not really. And I said neither did I. Not all of it. But I do now. The estate settled without contest. Diane and Carter are working through things in a way that I believe, though I am not certain, may result in them finding their way back to each other or not, but will result in Carter finding his way back to himself, which is the thing that matters most. Gerald Marsh, the college roommate who had provided the contact that started all of it, was named in the documentation Daniel had provided to the federal investigators. That investigation had been closed. But when Harold, acting on Daniel's instructions, provided the full documentation to the Maritime Regulatory Authority in the appropriate jurisdiction, it was reopened. The details of what followed are ongoing and not mine to tell. But Gerald Marsh is not currently managing other people's difficult problems. Warren Chesley, the financial consultant, all sent a bill for his time. Harold sent a response on my behalf that was 3 paragraphs long and that I suspect Warren found informative. I have not heard from Warren since. The $50 check that Diane slid across the restaurant table, I did not cash it. I put it in an envelope and mailed it back with a note that said only, "For your bus fare." I am not proud of that. Exactly. But I am not ashamed of it either. It was the only small joke I allowed myself in the whole long story. And I think Daniel, who had a sense of ceremony about important things, would have appreciated it. I still live in Gloucester, 3 blocks from the water. I still maintain the boat, though I have hired a young woman named Sophia Reyes who knows more about marine engines than I will ever learn, and who is, with my full support and Daniel's company behind her, completing her naval engineering certification. The work of the company continues quiet, specialized, unglamorous work that turns out to matter enormously to the people who depend on it. I have learned to read the contracts myself. Harold is patient. I have also learned that a man's life, when you finally see the whole of it, is larger and more complicated and more honorable than the version he showed you while he was living. Daniel was not perfect. He was frightened and human, and he made choices that cost him more than they should have. But when the moment came that counted, he told the truth. He paid what he owed. He arranged, with the careful precision of a man who builds navigation systems for a living, for the people he loved to find their way home after he was gone. That is what I carry. That is the inheritance that cannot be contested. The thing no consolidation structure can touch. The name that came back to me across a table in a dead man's handwriting here is the truth. Here is what it cost. Here is what you are worth. And I found that I was worth, at last, everything. Here is the lesson. And this is what Dad's cold justice stands for. The most important documents in any life are not the ones filed with lawyers or stamped by courts. They are the ones we owe each other. In the true accounts of who we were and what we chose when choosing was hard, Daniel carried his truth in silence for 20 years because he believed silence was protection. It was not. It was simply a delay, a postponement of the reckoning that the truth always, eventually, demands. What I learned in that room in Marblehead, listening to Harold read my husband's voice back to me. Is this a lie? Protected by shame is not a foundation. It is a floor that will eventually give way. The only thing strong enough to build on is the full, unvarnished, costly truth. If you could have been in that room, what would you have said to Carter? Let us know in the comments. And if this story found you at the right moment, please share it with someone who needs to hear that honesty. Even late, even expensive, is always worth it. We'll be here at Dad's Cold Justice, where the truth always gets the last word.